Hello and welcome to the video presentation for Module 13. Today we're going to talk about the harmonization with using augmented sixth chords, and we're also going to talk about a new texture for our harmonizations. So the objectives for this video are to explore the use of augmented sixth chords in harmonizations, and to be able to harmonize a melody in folk song, or what's also called boom chick style. Okay. So a quick little refresher about harmonization. We've done this a couple times. Harmonization is the process of adding chords to a given melody. And the chords you pick should do three things. The chords must be consonant with the melody, or, and this is really important because we're going to change the texture up, or they can create a dissonance, but that dissonance is correctly resolved. The chords should result from good voice leading, particularly between the outer voices. And the chords must create a logical harmonic progression. So let's talk about harmonic progression again. You can see the little maps we talked about last time. You pretty much remember that. So the primary way that you can pick chords is by thinking about their function, right? And chords proceed from the tonic to the dominant, back to the tonic. They can also go from the tonic to a predominant area to the dominant area, right? You can also think about a chord progression in terms of circle of fifths or other sequences of chords. So there are a couple ways you can approach it. Now, you can see that I've put the borrowed chords in there in the predominant section of the harmonic function chart. And that's because all the chords we've been learning about so far have all had a predominant function. And you remember from the reading that the new chords, the augmented sixth chords, also have a predominant function. So our Italian six, our French augmented six, and our German augmented six all have a predominant function. And so they will lead to the dominant chord. Okay? And now it is possible, of course, to go from a tonic chord to a predominant chord, like an augmented sixth, right? So you can go from a tonic directly to an augmented sixth chord and then to the dominant. But there's actually a better way to do it. So augmented sixth chords are really jarring because they have, the sharp four is something that we don't really hear even in borrowing, right? So it has that really jarring augmented sixth sound. So instead of being preceded by a tonic, they're usually preceded by other predominant chords, okay? And mostly it's the four chord, or the minor four chord in a minor key, right? And, well, I guess you could borrow it in the major too if you wanted to. But that is the chord that most often leads to the augmented sixth chord. And that's because it has the fourth scale degree in it, and that can lead through chromatic passing tone to become the sharp fourth scale degree. It also has the sixth scale degree in it, which can be altered as well, being lowered through a chromatic passing tone on the way down. And that interval, right, creates the augmented sixth sound, all right? So it's especially used in first inversion because that way you can have the sixth degree of the scale on the bass note. And that's how the chords most often happen. You can also get to a augmented sixth through a 2, or maybe like a 6 in minor, or also a flat 6 in major can lead to an augmented sixth chord. So those are all some ideas of predominant chords that can lead to augmented sixth. Of course, there are a lot of other possibilities too, like you can come up with some kind of like secondary dominant that would have, through voice leading could create an augmented sixth chord, for example. There are a lot of different possibilities, but these are, I think, the most common ones. And then you have to think about what chord will come after the German augmented sixth. And as we saw before, and we know from reading from last time, all augmented sixth chords can lead directly to 5. The only exception is the German, right? And the German must lead to a 1-6-4 before going to 5. And that's to avoid parallel fifths. Now, of course, the French and Italian can go to the 6-4, the 1-6-4 instead of the 5 if they want to. That's also a possibility, but they're not required to by voice leading. Okay, so that's how augmented sixth chords fit into harmonic progressions. Let's talk about the new texture we're going to use. And so our new texture consists of three things. The first is a single melody line, okay, which will be on the top staff of the melody, of the arrangement. It'll be all by itself. You won't be adding any notes to that staff, okay? One thing to note is that in the texture we're going to develop, not every note will get a chord. So this is not going to be like our chorales where we're changing a chord on every single beat. Now we'll be changing chords less than every single beat. Okay, so the harmonic rhythm will be slower. It will also consist of a piano bass line. So we'll have one note per chord, basically. And this is the left hand of what is a piano accompaniment. And it's the bottom staff. Okay? And this note, of course, is the bass note of each chord, just like we'd write a bass note for our chorales. The same rules apply to it. Okay? And then finally, the middle voice, right? The middle part in this arrangement will be piano chords, and that'll be played by the right hand, which will look like the middle staff of this arrangement. Okay? And there's some rules for these chords. They have to be playable by a human, non-Rachmaninoff, non-Liszt hand, so they have to span an octave or less. Okay? And they're also typically either three notes or 4 notes. Okay? They will complete the chord. So harmonies will be complete unless there's some like voice leading reason not to have it complete in the right hand. And you want to avoid clashes with the melody whenever possible. It's not always possible to do this because we want our chords to move as smoothly as possible to each other, right? But you want to avoid any things like, especially minor seconds and any other kind of dissonant interval. You can get away with things like major seconds; those are a little bit softer. But in general, you want to avoid clashes with the melody. Now, some clashes are okay, like if the clash only lasts for like an eighth note and goes away quickly, that's fine, right? Or if it just happens for a single moment of the accompaniment. And so it's okay because these accompanying chords go away so quickly. There's a quarter note rest between each chord in the right hand, so you have a little bit of time for your ear to kind of ignore any clashes or things like that might happen. So there's a lot more flexibility in this style. Okay, that being said, we still want to think about a few things when we write this. We can't just kind of write notes. So the first thing to be aware of is, and we're going to talk about these in detail, but there's a much slower harmonic rhythm in this. So before, when we had our chorales, right, we were changing chords on every single note of the melody. Sometimes we had non-chord tones. But now things are a lot slower. So chords will be at least 2 beats long, right? And you will typically have either 2 chords in a measure or maybe even 1 chord in a measure. So you don't have to pick as many chords. So the downside of that is that, now that not every note will get harmonized, that means you have to decide which ones will get harmonized and which ones will be non-chord tones. So there's a little bit of a puzzle to figure out when you're trying to do these harmonizations. You also have to be aware of voice leading. So like I said, the chords and the bass line should all move as smoothly as possible to create, as the result of good voice leading, right? So the bass is really obvious. The bass is an outer voice. That should follow our plain old rules of voice leading. And in theory, the inner voices, the part that is in the right hand, right, the accompanying parts, they should also follow good voice leading. But you may not always be able to do that because this also has to be playable. So because this is an instrument and it's being played by a person with a limited amount of fingers, right, it's not, you might end up in situations where the ideal voice leading is not really possible. So you'll have to sacrifice the voice leading in order for it to be playable. Okay? So let's examine this example here and see if we can kind of talk about these 4 points a little bit in depth. Okay, so for the first point, slow harmonic rhythm. And like I said, you'll either have 1 or 2 chords per measure, right? So let's do some examination of what's happening here and see if we can find where the chords change here. Now, it's usually indicated by the bass. So you can see that the first chord, right, from this G in the left hand, we have a B, a D, and a G in the right hand. So that looks like a 1 chord in this key. So the 1 chord lasts for these first 2 beats of the measure. Okay? You don't need to add the brackets there, but I'm just showing you that the chord encompasses everything that happens within those 2 beats. All right? So the first chord there is a 1 chord. Now this harmonic rhythm continues, so we have an F natural in the next bass note. The rest of the chords sustains, right? So we have the same notes. So to me, this looks like a 5, 4, 2 of 4, because that F is introduced, which brings us temporarily to the key of C. Our next chord here, right? We have an E in the bass and then a C, E, G in the right hand. So that's like a 4, 6 in this key. And then we have an E flat here and a C sharp, and that is the interval of an augmented 6. So this is an augmented 6 chord of some kind. And if we look at it, we see that we have a third, the G. We also have an A, right, in the bottom part of that chord. So this is actually a French augmented 6th. And then over here, that resolves to a D in the bass. So this looks like a 5 chord, which it is. And it looks like this 5 chord continues through this whole bar, right? Because we have 2 Ds here. But we also have a C natural introduced. So this is kind of like a 5, 7. Yeah. So you can see that the chords follow a harmonic rhythm of, 1 chord change every half note. Okay, so we get 2 chords per bar instead of 4 chords per bar, which is what we're used to with our chorales and things like that. So let's talk about non-chord tones and which ones fit into the chord and which ones don't. So it looks like when this was being written, this A was identified as a non-chord tone, and specifically it's a passing tone. Okay, and so it doesn't belong in this chord because this chord only has a G, a B, and a D, right? So A doesn't belong. So it's just used as a passing tone. Over here we have a leap, and a leap usually indicates that this is some kind of harmony. Because usually leaps, they don't resolve down by step, right? Which they actually do in this case. But leaps usually indicate that we're outlining a triad of some kind, right? Because triads have leaps in them. So often leaps can be used to imply harmony. So here, B and D, I think, suggests that the chord also should have B and D in it. And so both of those notes are chord tones because they are some kind of leap. So that's one indication of something, of a reason that something could be a chord tone and not a non-chord tone. Okay? Over here with this C, right, we had to decide which ones, in this beat were chord tones, which ones weren't. So another thing that can determine whether or not something is one of those is the length of time it takes up. So typically, the chord tones will be accented, and the non-chord tones will be unaccented, or unemphasized, de-emphasized, I guess. And they're de-emphasized by either being on a weak beat or by being shorter, right? So this B and this A are both short notes, right? They're both eighth notes, and they're also on a weak beat of the measure, so they're on beat 2 of the measure. This C, on the other hand, is on a strong beat of the measure, and it's also longer. So if we had to decide which ones are chord tones and which ones are non-chord tones, I think the evidence suggests, since the C is on a strong beat, a downbeat, and it's longer, that that's the non-chord tone, and these two shorter notes are passing tones because they're on a weak part of the meter, and they're also shorter. Okay, so they're given less rhythmic emphasis. All right, and then of course this G is held out, so that pretty much has to be a chord tone. And yep, it belongs in that French augmented sixth. Okay, over here we have an A on the downbeat of the measure, and again this B doesn't belong, so that's being treated as a passing tone, a non-chord tone. Okay, over here we have a leap, right? This leap is from C to A, which suggests that this could be part of a triad because it doesn't resolve to anything. And so we've decided to use a 5/7 since C and A belong in that chord there, the 5/7 chord. Okay, so that's how a quick little discussion about how you could make a case for something being a passing tone or a non-passing tone. Now, of course, it's all up to you, right? You could do whatever you wanted to, but you have to make logical decisions that fit into the harmonic plan of what you want to do, right? Okay, So let's talk about the voice leading. And the voice leading will be primarily between the bass, that'll be your main focus, but also the notes of the right hand. So here we've created a really nice voice leading pattern of going down a whole step, going down a half step, right? That's the seventh, and that should resolve down by step, which it does. Okay. Then we have our sixth degree of the scale, which moves by chromatic passing tone to become the lowered sixth degree of the scale, which should be resolved down by half step to D, which it is, and then repeated to be in place for the 5/7 as well. So a nice little sort of chromatic line. The first one's a whole step, but the rest is chromatic. So that's really nice there. Okay, and then we have oblique motion right between these two chords, which is a good voice leading thing. Then a smooth motion with these two voices moving up, opposite to the bass. So that's contrary motion, and also oblique motion. Okay, and then here we have oblique motion because we're holding that G over, and this is where the playability comes up against the good voice leading. So we have to make this a French augmented sixth, and so there's really no good way to, like, you know, ideally you'd want to get to that A in a different way, but there's not really any way to do that while making this still playable by a piano player, right? So what we do is we don't worry about it. So the C goes up like it should, so chromatic passing tone to C sharp, but then we just kind of get that A however we can, right? And so it just needs to fill out the harmony. There's not really a good way to do that. Now, if we had put that maybe up here, that would have created a pretty big clash with that G here. So that's not the best idea, especially on a note that's held out, okay, and a note that's not treated like a non-chord tone. So using the A on the top voice there is not really an option. Okay, but then in the next chord, right, that C sharp does what it's supposed to do. It resolves up to the D in the next chord. This third of that augmented sixth chord does what it's supposed to do. It resolves down to that F sharp. And notice that I'm talking about the voice leading even though there is a rest in between, because the voice leading will carry over even though that rest is there. Okay? And then that A is sustained in that voice too, right? Just like it should be. So with this, we want to follow as many voice leading rules as possible, but we can't make it unplayable, right? So you can't have anything that's bigger than an octave. So you have to kind of balance, you know, what is good voice leading versus what is actually playable. Okay? And you can see here I've made the decision to leap up. And you know, there may be a smoother way to do that, but it's okay if you make little leaps like that. And this also reinforces the melody line as well. So that's allowed, you're allowed to do that too, but keep it as smooth as possible. You know, following good voice leading when you can. And if you're not able to keep it playable, right, it's okay to sacrifice the ideal voice leading for playability. Okay, so let's look at an example from the ground up. So this is a harmonization with a melody here, and the harmonization must include an augmented sixth chord, and it must be in the boom chick or folk song style, right? And just to make the point, it's called boom chick because the bass is the boom, right? We have that note in the bass, and then the chick is the chord, so it sounds like boom chick, which is the overall effect of that accompaniment. Okay, so like all harmonizations, you want to start by planning out what your cadences are going to be, right? Identifying your phrases and then planning out where your cadences are going to be. So it looks like the last phrase maybe is here, and phrases are always indicated by rhythm. So this ends with a whole note, which is the longest note in this whole piece. So this looks like a phrase. Then over here, we have maybe a phrase that ends on that half note there. Okay, so those are our two phrases. Now it's always good to end with a something strong, like a perfect authentic cadence. So let's plan on doing that. And you can put in some bass notes. So this is the key of B flat. So you could put in a bass note F, and the final bass note could be a B flat. Okay, so 5-1, you could write in the harmonization or the harmony there you want to use. Over here we have a little bit of a difficult decision because we have a lot of notes in this measure, right? It's a lot less clear about what's happening here. So we could maybe decide what kind of chord we're going to end on. And so there are a lot of possibilities. You could end on maybe like a 6 chord, and you could maybe make this like a deceptive cadence. You could end this on a 1 chord and maybe make it some kind of like imperfect authentic cadence, right? I think what we'll do, and you can always change your plan later, but let's plan on ending this on a 1. So this will be some kind of like imperfect cadence. So we'll go ahead and put a B flat here and plan on ending on a 1 chord. Now, the question is what kind of chord can come before that? So if this is going to be a chord tone, this D, right? Then that means that one of these other ones has to be a non-chord tone for this beat. So we're going to decide which one of those we're going to use as a chord tone. Okay? All right, so once you've decided kind of what you're going to end on, so we're ending our first phrase on 1 and our last phrase on 1, then you want to decide where you're going to start. Good place to start is usually the 1 chord as well. So let's plan on doing that. So 1. And then over here we have, in the second phrase, we have a E flat, right? So that could be harmonized by a 4 chord. It could be harmonized by a 2 chord. I'm sure there's another possibility I'm not thinking of. I don't remember. Oh, the 7, yeah, the 7 chord as well. So you could do that. But I think since this is the beginning, we maybe don't want to start with a dominant. Let's maybe plan on harmonizing this with a 4 chord. So we'll put an E flat to indicate that. Okay. Now remember, we also have to find a place to use some kind of augmented 6th as well. So we'll keep that in mind as well. All right, so let's go from this first measure. Now, you want to look for things that are leaps, because leaps indicate chords. Steps usually indicate that we'll have some kind of non-chord tone that we have to account for. So we want to decide what we're going to do. So we start off with a leap between a D and a B flat, which to me implies the harmony that we chose, which was 1. So I think that'll work fine. Here we have another leap between a C and an A. C and A exist in the 7 chord, right? It also exists in the 5 chord. So I think the best chord for this situation, since that C to A leap kind of implies the 5 chord, would be to use the 5 chord here. All right? And we can always go back and change inversions if we want to. Now we have to decide what we're going to do with this. And so it's a stepwise pattern. So we have to kind of account for what we chose to come before, which is a 5 chord, right? So 5 is usually followed by the tonic, right? So the best thing to do here is probably use some kind of 1 chord. And if we use a 1 chord, that means that the C, we'll call it a passing tone. Okay? Now you could also change the plan up if you wanted to. You could maybe say that this B flat is the passing tone and the C is the chord tone, in which case you could use a 5 here. So that's a possibility as well. I'm not sure what that would sound like. You could always, your ear is always the best choice. So let's see what that would sound like. So the first option I'll use is the B flat. Okay, so going to the 1 chord in the second measure. And then the second option will be going to the 5 chord in the second measure. So this is option 1. Okay, let's see what happens when we stick with the 5 there. A little bit less convincing. I wonder what would happen if we did like an inversion. That's not bad. I think I didn't love any of those. It's something about having the tonic note as an accented passing tone that sounds kind of weird to me. So I think we will just stick with a 1. Now if we did want to give it some variety, since we have two, we just started with 1 and we don't want this to sound like it gets to a convincing ending quickly, we could invert this. So maybe we can go to a 1 chord, 1/6 chord here, okay? Which gives it a little bit more variety in the bass and keeps the tension going until we get to that last B flat. Okay, it's not bad. All right, now let's figure out what we're gonna do with the rest of this. Okay, so starting with this E flat, we've decided to use an E flat there, which means that this is a passing tone, D, right? Let me erase this. It's not a passing tone anymore. All right. So now we need to decide what this chord is going to be. And we still haven't found a home for our augmented 6, and we're getting kind of towards the end. I know that we could use it here all the way at the end, but it's usually followed, the augmented 6 is usually preceded by a 4 chord, and we have a 4 chord here. So maybe we could use our augmented 6th here. So what bass note would that be for an augmented 6th? Well, if we use it in the correct position, it should be a G flat, because it's the lowered 6th scale degree, and lowered 6th in this key is a G flat. So that will resolve down to an F here, okay? And so we could use this is our augmented 6th, which means we need to build the augmented 6 using some other interval. Now, this does have a Re in it, so this could be a French augmented 6th if we wanted to, but it also resolves down by step to become the 1. So we could look at this in a couple ways. We could call this a passing tone, and this could be maybe an Italian augmented 6th, or that could be part of the chord that just doesn't stick around, which is less likely, so it could be a French augmented 6th. I think we'll treat it as a passing tone that resolves down to the tonic, and we'll just stick with plain old Italian augmented 6th here. Okay. Now here we have a 4th, and this has to resolve down to F, so we're stuck with a little bit of an issue here. Now you could do a couple things. You could treat this as a suspension because it's repeated. Okay, in which case you would call this a 5 chord. And just have like a 4/3 suspension. I think that's actually a pretty good solution. You could also call it a 6/4 chord if you wanted to, 1/6/4. That's another possibility. I think we'll stick with a 5 just because it'll be nice to kind of stretch out a single harmony for this whole bar, especially towards the end. So let's call it a 5, and this will be a suspension, and it'll be a 4/3 suspension if we want to get technical. Okay, so we have our bass line. I'll go ahead and play that. Now we forgot to do one thing, which was we didn't incorporate that G flat as a non-chord tone pattern. So we need to fix that, and the easiest way to do that is to invert this 4 chord so that it creates a chromatic passing tone with that G flat. So we'll invert this to a 4/6 and put G on the bottom of the chord. Let's see if that smoothed it out. Yeah, that's a pretty convincing harmonization there. Now there are a lot of other possibilities, of course. One thing you could do actually is you could make this into a 6 chord in your harmonization if you wanted to. It would be like a 6/6/4, I guess. but it'd be like an arpeggiated 6/4. So that's something you could do there. It's kind of like a deceptive cadence if you wanted to. So yeah, that would change. You wouldn't even have to change the bass note if you wanted to do that. So there are, of course, infinite possibilities for these things. Now, let's write our right-hand accompaniment. And it's always best, I think, to kind of start in kind of away from the melody in a lot of ways, to give the melody some room. So maybe making the F as the highest note is a good place to start. So we'll voice our first chord like that. Okay, then we need to have this chord move smoothly to our next chord, so we can keep the F, and then through oblique motion, everything else can move down to be a C and an A. Okay, and then you want to continue the smoothness, right? So we're calling this a 1/6 still, so we'll put a rest there, and maybe we can just move back to where we were before. Okay, and giving the melody some space prevents us from writing any like harsh clashes with what's going on up there. All right. And then this chord sticks around. So the great thing about slow harmonic motion is sometimes you can just keep on repeating. Vamp, as it were. Okay. Now we want to move to voicing the 4 chord. So add that rest. And moving up smoothly, right? Maybe we want to move in the opposite direction of our bass. So always be aware of voice leading. So let's voice this as a G, an E flat, and keep that B flat from before. Okay. Then we get to our augmented 6 chord, and we have to create the augmented 6th. And so the augmented 6th is created with the lowered 6th scale degree, which we have, and the raised 4th scale degree, which will be an E natural. So we need to get that smoothly as we can. So that E natural can come from this E flat. So we can go ahead and write that in here. So even though there's a rest, we still hear it as voice leading from that E flat to that E natural there. Right? So we'll put an E natural here. If we're going to make it Italian, we need to add in the B flat, which is the 3rd above the G flat. Now you always, you're supposed to double the B flat. Of course, on a piano, doubling it's sort of irrelevant, but you could, if you wanted to, you could leap up and make this chord here, right? Which just reinforces the melody, and it lets you double that B flat to keep 4 voices. There's not really anything else you could double, because you don't want to double that G flat, because that has to resolve down by step, and that'll just sound pretty weird. So you could do this if you wanted to. Now in the next chord, we want to make it a 5, right? But we have a B flat on top, so if we voiced it like A, F, C, we'd have a half-step dissonance between our B flat and our A in the top of the chord there. So we don't want to do that. So we might want to just get rid of that A on top and move that down an octave lower so that we have a chord like that. Okay? And that lets our B flat from before resolve up to the 5th like it should. Okay? I'm sorry, down to the A. B flat resolves down to the A. And also, another thing to keep in mind is, the B flat goes up to the C, but it also goes down to the A. So it's kind of like that B flat is splitting in 2 directions. Okay, and then you could just repeat this if you wanted to. You could also, if you want to make this a little bit more interesting, is make this a 7th chord. So keep that F. And then with this style, you can just add in that E flat if you want to. Okay. And then you could end this with a quarter rest and a B flat triad, and you could maybe make it a dotted half note. Okay. So there's the accompaniment we wrote. Let's see if I can play this with both hands. All 3 lines on the piano here. So let's see what this sounds like. Didn't play it perfectly, but I thought that was a pretty nice harmonization. I really like that Italian sixth there. Okay, great. Well, that is a tutorial on how to use augmented sixth chords in harmonizations, and also how to use the new boom chick style of writing. Okay. So if you have any questions about this, we can talk about it in the Zoom session. And yeah, you can also contact me via email or however you want to get in touch. That'd be great. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching this, and have a great night.